Frank Jennings is 85 years old, a retired Marine, a widower, and a man who's spent the last decade in silence until the day someone mistook that silence for weakness. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in Crow Ridge, a quiet town where everyone knows everyone, and where an old veteran still volunteered to wipe down tables at the bar he once built with his bare hands. That's when a biker, loud drunk and looking to prove something, punched him in the face for doing what he'd always done: serve without asking for credit. No one in the bar stepped in. No one said a word. Frank bled alone. But 30 minutes later, the quiet turned into something else entirely. Because Frank Jennings had a son, Jake, who once led a covert special operations team across 3 continents. And when he picked up that call, he didn't bring rage. He brought order, precision, discipline, and 8 other men who knew exactly how to stand when honor is threatened. What happened next didn't just shake a bar. It shook a community awake, because sometimes the people we ignore are the ones who once held the line for all of us. So let me ask, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. This story isn't just Frank's. It's for anyone who believes dignity doesn't retire. It was just past noon on a quiet Saturday when Frank Jennings pushed open the wooden door of the Iron Barrel, a bar tucked between a pawn shop and an abandoned hardware store in the fading town of Crow Ridge. The hinges groaned, the door creaked, but Frank didn't flinch. He never did. 85 years old, a veteran of 2 wars, and the kind of man who believed the best way to stay alive was to keep showing up even when no one asked you to. The sun cut through the dusty windows and lit the hardwood floors like stained glass in a forgotten chapel. Frank didn't pause to admire it. He didn't pause for anything. His steps were slow, deliberate, and worn in from habit. He had come here every Saturday since the place opened back when it bore his name and served men who remembered what it meant to earn respect instead of demanding it. But things had changed. The regulars were gone, replaced by louder voices and heavier boots. 6 bikers had taken up space near the back, each one marked with patches that suggested violence without quite stating it. Their laughter was sharp, meant to be heard, and no one challenged them. The bartender kept to his end of the counter. The manager had already retreated to the back office. Frank said nothing. He never did. He nodded at the counter, pulled a faded cleaning cloth from his pocket, and turned toward the nearest empty table. Beer had pooled on the wood. He leaned in and wiped it without hesitation, without asking who the table belonged to, without checking for approval. Kyle Mason noticed. He stood slowly towering over Frank like a bad memory. Early 40s, barrel-chested and constantly smirking, Kyle carried himself like someone who thought fear was power. "This table's mine, old man." Frank didn't look up. He finished wiping, moved to the next circle of condensation. Kyle stepped closer. "Can't you see you're too damn old to be doing this?" Frank didn't answer. The punch came fast, blunt, and deliberate. A right hook straight into the side of Frank's face. It connected hard, sending him stumbling back into a bar stool. The room fell silent. Blood ran from Frank's cheek, soaking into his collar. No one moved. Not the bartender, who resumed drying glasses that were already dry. Not the manager, who stayed hidden in the back. Not the handful of patrons, most of whom had served in the same wars Frank had now pretending their beers were fascinating. Kyle spat on the floor. Thought so. Frank steadied himself against the counter. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his fists. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a flip phone, and dialed 1 number. "Jake," he said, voice calm, despite the red trailing down his jaw. "There's been a situation. At the Iron Barrel." A pause. Then, "No, I'm fine, but I think you'll want to come down." He closed the phone, tucked it back in his pocket. Kyle laughed. "What you calling the retirement home?" Frank didn't answer. He pulled out his cloth again, dabbed his cheek, and sat down on the nearest stool, like the bleeding didn't matter. At the far end of the bar, a college-aged girl, quiet, unnoticed, until now lowered her phone slowly. She had recorded everything, not for likes, not for clout, just because something in her gut said, "This isn't right. Someone needs to see this." Her name was Emily Tran. She didn't say a word. Just hit upload. In less than 5 minutes, the footage would start spreading first to a few hundred followers, then to thousands, then to someone who could not ignore it. But Frank didn't know her. Didn't need to. He wasn't waiting for the internet to speak. He was waiting for something older, quieter, heavier. Some calls don't bring sirens. They bring people who know what to do without being told. And soon, Crow Ridge would learn what it means when a quiet man finally reaches for the phone. Not for help, but for justice, wrapped in silence. The line disconnected with a soft click, but the silence that followed inside the old ranch house felt heavier than a mortar blast. Jake Jennings stood still in the center of the den. The flip phone still open in his hand, eyes locked on nothing. The windows were open, and the breeze stirred the edges of a tactical map spread across his table. Weathered edges folded and unfolded hundreds of times. He had been planning a private security seminar, something quiet, off the record, just enough to feel useful without being seen. But that voice, his father's voice, cut through 20 years of layered instinct, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Jake didn't need details. He had grown up watching a man who never asked for help, not even when they buried his wife, not when he lost his hearing in one ear, not when the VA got his records wrong. That man just made do. So when Frank Jennings called and said there was a situation, Jake didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask who was involved. He just closed the map and rolled it up in a single motion. His movements were automatic, born of repetition, but his face was different now, tightened, sharpened. "Something wrong?" Colonel Leo asked from the barn doorway, his boots still muddy from the range. Tall, wiry, and always reading the room before anyone else. Leo hadn't called Jake Colonel in years. Jake looked up. "We're going to Crow Ridge." Leo paused. "That's your dad's town, right?" Jake didn't respond. Instead, he walked past him to the storage closet near the back wall key already in hand. It clicked open with the precision of someone who still counted seconds by instinct. Inside was a single military-grade trunk, black, dented, and sealed. He knelt and opened it slowly. Inside lay a carefully arranged set of Gearfield radio-encrypted satellite phone folded fatigues and a leather-bound folder with no markings. It hadn't been touched in years. Until now. Sam entered next. "You just shut down your own seminar." What gives Jake's answer was short. "Crow Ridge, Dad's bar." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Bar fight, number..." Jake's voice was flat. Dad called. "That's the story." That landed harder than any explanation, because Frank Jennings didn't call. Ever. Cruz was the last to arrive holding a thermos and half a sandwich. He froze when he saw the gear. "What the hell are we walking into?" Jake snapped the trunk shut. "Something small that means something big." That's all you need to know. There was no argument. These men weren't under Jake's command anymore. But some habits survive discharge. When he moved, they followed. Jake grabbed the encrypted phone and dialed 2 numbers from memory. "We'll need 2 vehicles. Unmarked. 1 SUV, 1 transport. We move in 20. No heavy gear, no visible weapons." "This isn't Kandahar." Leo gave a low chuckle. "But it sounds like someone just triggered the wrong man's bloodline." Jake didn't smile. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out across the Colorado Valley, endless dry hills, horses grazing in the distance, and windmills creaking softly in rhythm. He took a deep breath, as if memorizing the quiet. Then he muttered more to himself than anyone else. "Last op. This one's personal." He turned back to the team. "Prep light kits, civilian mode. We're not going in loud. We're going in fast." The rest of the house turned into muscle memory bags packed without instructions. Formation decided without speaking. Sam loaded the transport vehicle while Cruz checked regional maps. Leo worked the comms securing route clearance with a contact at the state trooper office. By the time the convoy rolled out of the ranch gate, everything had shifted. Not in protocol, but in gravity. Jake wasn't returning as a commander. He wasn't returning as a civilian either. He was returning as a son. And beneath that silent determination, something else stirred, something none of them voiced. When a man like Jake Jennings moved, it meant a boundary had been crossed, and the people who crossed it were about to understand what that meant. None of them knew yet that across the country, a video had just been posted by a girl named Emily Tran. A shaky recording of an old man being punched in the face inside a dusty bar in Crow Ridge. In the caption she wrote, Is this what we've become? It hadn't gone viral, not yet. But that moment was coming fast, gathering velocity like a match near dry brush. Jake didn't know about the video. He didn't need to. The phone call was enough. But the rest of the country was about to see what Frank Jennings never asked for, and Jake Jennings never ignored. And the storm that was forming had nothing to do with views, shares, or hashtags. It was built on something older, something sharper. It was called honor. While Crow Ridge was still quiet, storefronts unopened, sidewalks empty, the day not yet decided, the rest of the country was already seething. The footage of Frank Jennings being struck inside the iron barrel had ignited something far beyond state lines. It began as a ripple passed between private group chats and veteran forums. Then it surged onto TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, picking up speed and volume like a freight train with no brakes. Within hours, the video was everywhere, and Frank Jennings wasn't just a man anymore. He had become a symbol. The hashtag #JotBosherJustice. For Frank Jennings trended faster than anyone expected, first regionally, then nationally. Influencers reposted it, news aggregators embedded it, political commentators quoted it. For one rare moment, timelines aligned. Liberals, conservatives, veterans, activists, they all saw the same image: an old man punched in the face, blood trailing down his cheek, while a bar full of people sat in silence. And none of them could look away. Reaction videos poured in. Combat veterans went live from garages and porches, struggling to say anything beyond clenched jaws. "We don't leave our own one," Marine said quietly, staring into the lens with a fury he barely contained. "You don't do this to a man like that. Not ever." Civilians were just as vocal. "My grandfather wore that same patch," a teenager said in her TikTok response. "He's not around anymore, but I hope someone would have stood up for him." It wasn't just the punch. It was the failure around it. The chairs that didn't scrape back the hands, that didn't rise the eyes that looked away. The video didn't scream. It accused. And people were listening. By early afternoon, the mayor's office in Crow Ridge was overwhelmed. So was the police station. Calls came from other states, other countries. Emails stacked up by the hundreds, many of them addressed directly to city officials. "Protect this man. Do your job. If you won't, we will." Someone mailed a printed still from the video with one handwritten line in black Sharpie he served. You watched. Meanwhile, news outlets scrambled to reframe their day. The footage aired on national broadcasts without needing commentary. Local reporters who arrived at the bar found more cameras than chairs. The bar's owner had already locked the doors, but that didn't stop the crowd from gathering out front. Most came in silence. Others came holding signs. "Veterans deserve dignity. We see you, Frank." One woman taped a Purple Heart sticker to the bar window and quietly stepped away. Online things escalated further. Military forums dug up Frank's service record, or what they could piece together. Korea. Vietnam. Mentions in old citations. A photo from 1969 showed Frank Jennings carrying a wounded squad mate through mud-soaked terrain, his own arm bloodied. The image was reposted beside a still from the video: "Same man, different century, same courage." The caption read, "54 years later, still standing alone." Hashtag movements followed. Stand with Frank. Earn your seat. But the one that stuck, burned into banners, bios, and signs, was the original "Justice for Frank Jennings." And with it came momentum. A senator tweeted support. A famous actor reposted the video with one sentence: "Some things we should all be furious about." By the end of the day, cable news hosts were quoting retired generals, and a nonprofit had set up a fund to support Frank with legal aid, medical care, and if he wanted it, security. But for all the noise online, it was the silence from Frank himself that struck hardest. He hadn't released a statement. He hadn't answered reporters. He hadn't even left the bench in front of the bar. That silence felt louder than any headline. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was restraint. A kind of quiet defiance no one quite knew how to process. What the internet didn't know, but would soon learn, is that Frank Jennings had never needed to speak for himself, because someone else was already on the move. His son, the one they called Colonel Jake Jennings, a man whose name didn't trend, a man whose service record didn't need hashtags. Jake wasn't rushing toward a spotlight. He was following a compass etched deeper than rank or duty. And he wasn't coming to Crow Ridge with press statements or demands. He was bringing something different. He was bringing the kind of men who had seen the worst corners of the world and still knew right from wrong. And for the first time in decades, they weren't answering to a chain of command. They were answering to blood. The highway unfurled ahead in a line of fading asphalt, empty, except for two vehicles moving in close formation. One was a matte gray SUV, the other a transport van with the same dull finish and the same lack of markings. Their windows were tinted, their lights discreet. Both carried plates clean enough to pass any checkpoint, but tied to names no one could follow. To the outside world, they were invisible in plain sight. Inside the SUV, Jake Jennings kept his hands steady on the wheel as the miles peeled away behind them. Leo sat in the passenger seat. Body relaxed, but alert, a man who could shift from silence to action in one breath. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch. The noise wasn't necessary. Finally, Leo glanced sideways. "You want to tell me what we're driving into?" Jake didn't look away from the road. "Crow Ridge." Leo paused. "This is about your dad." A single nod. Someone thought putting hands on him wouldn't matter. I want to make sure they were wrong. Behind them, the transport van carried Sam and Cruz. Sam, with his tablet propped on his knee, was scanning crowd estimates and cross-referencing media sources. Cruz, silent in the back seat, cleaned his glasses, then opened his medkit with mechanical precision, double-checking gauze, saline tourniquets more from instinct than expectation. Over comms, Sam's voice came through. "Jake, I'm seeing footage of growing numbers at the site. Mostly civilians, but a few familiar patches in the crowd. Looks like words reached every corner." Jake spoke into the mic, without emotion. "We don't react to the noise. We're not here for the press." Cruz's voice followed. "So what are we here for, exactly?" Jake's tone sharpened. "To stand. That's it. Not to provoke, not to posture. We walk in, we look them in the eye, and we make it clear that some names aren't forgotten and some people aren't touched without response." The radio fell quiet. Leo exhaled slowly. "It's been a while since we moved together like this." Jake's voice didn't shift. "It's not the same. This isn't deployment. This is personal." Cruz spoke up again, slower this time. "That thing in Philly. You still trust me after that?" Jake's eyes didn't leave the road. "That's why I brought you." Sam chuckled from the van. "Reckless loyalty. That's our brand." Jake allowed the corner of his mouth to shift. "It's always worked before." The two vehicles moved through a thinning line of farm towns and truck stops blending with the background, until they didn't. Crow Ridge was less than 40 minutes away. Local law enforcement frequencies began to buzz faintly through Sam's scanner, crowd control chatter, confused jurisdiction, calls, notes about press vans and angry phone lines. Jake stayed silent, but his posture shifted. This wasn't the city anymore. It wasn't the war zone either. It was the in-between, the moment before everything broke or healed. And they were arriving exactly at that fault line. Leo turned slightly. "You really think us being there makes a difference?" Jake finally looked at him. Not to them, to him. That landed. Everyone in those two vehicles knew what it meant. They weren't chasing revenge. They weren't staging anything. They were arriving with weight, not the kind you carry on your back, but the kind that walks into a room and makes people sit straighter without knowing why. Sam tapped his screen. "They've got the bar locked up. Media's set up outside. Police perimeter soft. I'd say we approach slow. No sudden presence." Jake nodded. "Keep it clean. No uniforms. No commentary." Leo grinned slightly. "That'll be hard for Cruz." Jake's voice dropped low. "Not today." The sun had begun to drop behind the hills, now casting their vehicles in shadow as they turned off the highway. Up ahead, the streets narrowed. The town crept into view, unaware that it was about to be centered in a storm it never asked for. But Jake hadn't come to warn them. He'd come to remind them, because for a team that once operated in silence under the veil of blacked-out reports and redacted mission files, there was no louder statement than showing up. They had no rank, no insignia, no mission briefing, just history and blood and the kind of loyalty that didn't expire when the paperwork ended. They were never supposed to exist. And yet now they were rolling back into the world not to prove anything, but to protect the man who had once taught them that the difference between being dangerous and being honorable was knowing when to walk in quietly. Back in town, Kyle Mason sipped another beer, unaware that every direction outside the bar had already started to narrow. The bar had gone quiet since the incident, but the back corner where the bikers held court was still alive, with cheap bravado and stale beer. Kyle Mason leaned back in a worn leather booth, legs-stretched boots propped on the table's edge like he owned the place. The light above flickered slightly, casting shadows across the patches sewn into his vest names of clubs, places he'd never actually served, and slogans he didn't earn. He grinned as he recounted the scene from earlier, exaggerating each detail for effect. Guy barely moved, Kyle said, voice loud enough to carry, but casual enough to sound rehearsed. I tell him this table's mine. He keeps wiping like he doesn't hear. So I gave him something to think about. Fist to jaw. Dropped him like a sack of potatoes. The others at the table chuckled, some out of habit, some out of nervous tension. None of them had actually seen Kyle in combat. Most had never served. Their leather and patches were for show rebellion worn like a costume. Kyle was different. He had worn the uniform, briefly, until it was taken from him. Across from him, one of the older bikers' graying beard, road-worn face didn't laugh. He stirred his drink, then said without looking up, "That wasn't just some old guy." Kyle narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old biker shrugged. "That was Frank Jennings. Saw him once, years back at a VFW ceremony. They said he pulled 5 guys out of a kill zone and Hugh came back shot twice." Kyle smirked. "You mean the same guy who bled on my boots today?" A few around the table shifted uneasily. The bravado was thinning. "He's a Marine," the old biker added, still calm. "Old, yeah, but he walked taller than any of us do now." Even after the punch, Kyle waved it off. "Let me tell you something about Marines. They all think they're untouchable. Truth is, half of them spent more time in chow lines than combat. Old man needed to learn there's a new order in town." I gave him a reminder. "You ever wear the uniform?" the old man asked, still not looking directly at him. That question hit the table like a dropped wrench. Kyle leaned forward. "Yeah, I did. Army. 8 years. 3rd Infantry." The old biker finally met his eyes. "That why you got that discharge dishonorable, right?" A long pause followed. Kyle's smile faded just slightly. "Not your business," he muttered. But everyone had heard it. They knew the rumors Kyle had been discharged after an altercation overseas, details sealed, but the whispers were consistent assault on a fellow soldier. Refused a direct order. Lost rank, lost benefits, walked out bitter and bruised. He never told the full story, just enough to maintain the illusion. Now that illusion cracked. One of the younger guys stood up. "Gonna get some air," he said and slipped out. Kyle watched him go, then turned back to the others, grin returning. "Whatever. Frank Jennings or whoever the hell he was got what he had coming. You don't walk into a biker's space acting like you own it." But his tone had changed. The words were thinner, less sharp. Because Kyle knew deep down what kind of man he had struck, he just wasn't ready to say it out loud. He'd seen that face before. Not in a bar, but in an old photograph during orientation, back when he still believed in chain of command, before the bitterness crept in, before the choices that got him thrown out. Frank Jennings didn't need to fight back. His silence had done more damage than any counterpunch. Another silence settled over the table. "Some men earn respect," the old biker said, finally standing up. Others tried to take it. He walked away without waiting for a response. Kyle sat still, jaw tight, beer going warm in his hand. The booth no longer felt like a throne. It felt exposed. He didn't notice that outside the sidewalk had started to crowd, that news crews had gathered across the street, that phones were aimed at the bar's windows. But more importantly, he didn't notice the slow, deliberate weight that had begun pushing toward him, silent, coordinated, focused. Because while Kyle spun his version of the truth to men who no longer believed him, Frank Jennings was still sitting outside. Blood dry, face bruised, back straight. And though his body hadn't moved in hours, his eyes hadn't left the front door. He wasn't waiting for police. He wasn't waiting for apologies. He was waiting for something far older, for something that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the kind that settles after a loud event, but the kind that arrives just before something breaks. Crowridge, a town usually defined by slow afternoons, and routine quiet had begun to stir in ways it hadn't in years. On Main Street, people who rarely left their porches now stood at sidewalks, phones in hand, murmuring to one another, not about gossip or weather, but about the approaching convoy. Emily Tran's live stream had been running non-stop. From the moment she heard engines on the horizon, she had positioned herself at the edge of the intersection near Cooper's grocery camera aimed down the road. The view was simple, just pavement power lines and heat shimmer, but her voice behind the phone was what kept people watching. "They're coming," she said. 2 vehicles. Matte gray. Military profile, but no markings. This isn't for show. They're not slowing down. By the time the first SUV rolled past the welcome sign, more than 6,000 people were watching online. 3 dozen had already gathered in person, drawn by rumors and reposts. Most didn't know who Jake Jennings was. They didn't need to. They only knew someone was coming. And it wasn't the police. The convoy moved with deliberate calm. No sirens, no horns. The SUV led, windows dark. The transport followed, equally quiet. Nothing about them was flashy. That was the point. Their restraint screamed louder than any uniform ever could. Crowridge's lone patrol car sat awkwardly near the intersection, its young officer deputy Mark Rule gripping his radio with both hands. He was 24, new to the force, and now the only uniformed presence standing between a growing crowd and something he couldn't categorize. His training hadn't covered this. No crime had been reported, no protest officially declared. Yet the tension on the street had the density of a fuse freshly lit. Inside his cruiser, Mark called dispatch again. "I have 2 incoming vehicles, civilian registration, but moving like tactical teams. There's no aggression, but people are gathering. It's escalating." The dispatcher didn't respond right away. "Then hold position. Maintain visibility. Do not engage." Across the street, a group of veterans had begun to form outside the hardware store. Most of them hadn't worn a uniform in decades, but their posture said they hadn't forgotten how. One leaned on a cane. Another stood arms crossed, eyes fixed on the road like he was waiting for roll call. A boy on a bike asked, "Are they soldiers?" No one man said there's something else. As the first vehicle reached town center, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just fell silent. Not out of fear, but recognition. The kind that comes when presence enters a room before the body does. Jake Jennings stepped out of the SUV without a word. He wasn't in uniform. No medals, no rank, no flag on his shoulder. Just boots that had touched more ground than most people could name, and eyes that scanned the crowd like a man measuring distance to target. Leo joined him, stepping around the front of the vehicle. Sam and Cruz exited the transport a moment later, Cruz carrying only a slim black case, and Sam holding a small tablet already connected to local signals. They didn't huddle or give orders. They just stood, each one grounded like stone, positioned with deliberate spacing. The crowd parted instinctively, not because they were told to, but because something about these men demanded space. Even the police officer stepped back without realizing it. Emily's phone caught the moment Jake looked down Main Street towards the Iron Barrel. He didn't blink, didn't speak. He just started walking. Each step slow, measured, like someone retracing old ground. The sidewalk beneath him seemed to harden the town itself, drawing taut. And with every step the air grew thicker, not heavier, sharper. As if the very idea of right and wrong had entered the street and expected an answer. He didn't wear a badge, didn't bring a gavel or law book, but his presence made people straighten up, put away their phones, remove their hats. Because something ancient had returned, not law, not revenge. Consequence. No one asked what was about to happen. They already knew. Jake wasn't here to demand justice. He was here to demonstrate it. Behind him, the others followed, silent, ready, not as a show of force, but as proof that some men still carried the weight of principle like armor, and with each footfall, Crowridge forgot its own excuses. Jake passed the parked police cruiser without acknowledgement, walked through the crowd, and turned toward the bar like it was the only building that had ever mattered. Then, with the town holding its breath behind him, he stepped up to the door of the Iron Barrel. Not like a customer, not like a witness, but like a man returning to a battlefield he never expected to see again. Jake paused just outside the doorway. The murmurs from the street faded as he turned to the bench beside the entrance. Frank Jennings sat upright, back straight, his hand still clutching the cloth that had dried with blood hours earlier. Their eyes locked. Jake said nothing at first. Frank didn't need an explanation. He had raised Jake to be the kind of man who never offered one when action would do. Jake leaned slightly, voice low. "You all right?" Frank nodded once. "I'm not the one who needs fixing." No further words were exchanged, just a mutual look, quiet, forged from the same iron, and a nod between father and son. Then Jake turned, reached for the door, and pushed it open. The creak of the hinges dragged across the bar like a slow blade. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut deep. Heads turned. Conversations didn't fade. They stopped completely. Light from the street spilled inside, but it wasn't the brightness that caught their attention. It was the silhouette standing at the threshold, framed like a verdict. Jake stepped in. The moment he crossed the floor, the air changed. Denser, slower. The way a room shifts when something's about to happen that no one can stop. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. His steps weren't loud, but the weight behind them made every other sound irrelevant. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the bartender froze mid-glass. Jake walked until he stood in the center of the room. He placed a small device on the nearest table, activated the screen, and turned it so everyone could see. The video played. No commentary. No cuts. Frank Jennings. The bar. The cloth. The punch. The fall. The silence that followed. And then Jake spoke. Who hit Frank Jennings' time. Didn't pause. It braced. Every gaze in the room turned to Kyle Mason, seated in the back corner, his face already pale, drained of any remaining defiance. He looked at Jake, then the screen, then his hands. The bottle he was holding felt heavier now. He set it down slowly. I didn't know who he was," he mumbled. Jake's voice was clear, unshaken. "That's not the question." The bartender dropped his gaze. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably. The owner appeared from the back hallway, paused when he saw the video still playing, then looked to Kyle. He said nothing. His face did all the talking. Jake stepped closer, tone low but cutting. "You hit a man because you thought he couldn't hit back, because you believed silence meant surrender." It didn't. Kyle opened his mouth, but the words crumbled. It was just Jake didn't let him finish. A moment, a mistake. A man, no. It was a choice, one that defines you. A veteran near the bar, weathered in his 60s, stood slowly. "I served with guys like him. Saw what they carried. You don't raise your hand to men like that. You lower your head." The bar remained silent. Jake looked around. "How many of you watched? How many of you said nothing?" No one answered, he continued. "Frank Jennings didn't ask for respect. He lived in a way that earned it. You had a chance to stand with him and you sat still. That tells me everything." Kyle tried again. "I didn't mean," Jake turned to face him fully. "You meant every part of it. The silence, the smirk, the second swing you almost took. You just didn't expect to be seen." Kyle looked away. Jake stepped back, voice steady. He didn't strike back because he didn't need to. You already proved who you are. Around the room, shoulders sagged. Eyes dropped. No one offered Kyle an exit. No one excused his actions. Even those who didn't throw the punch could now feel its weight resting in their own hands. Because when honor walks in, cowardice doesn't disappear. It drowns. Jake nodded once to Sam, who began collecting names. Leo retrieved the device. Cruz stood near the exit, arms crossed, unmoved. Jake's eyes swept the bar one final time. You don't get to choose what kind of man you are when people are watching. You show it when no one is, or when it's already too late. He turned for the door, and though he hadn't raised his voice once, the room would remember every word like a sermon. Jake didn't leave right away. He turned just short of the door, retraced 3 slow steps, and stopped beside Kyle Mason's table. The screen behind him still showed the final frame of the video, Frank on the floor, one hand bracing a stool, blood beginning to fall. The stillness in the bar now felt less like silence, and more like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. Jake leaned forward slightly, not looming, not aggressive, just close enough that Kyle had no choice but to meet his eyes. When he finally did, there was no rage there, no threat, just clarity. You didn't need to know who he was to treat him like a man, Jake said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But now everyone knows who you are. Kyle opened his mouth, searching for footing. It was a misunderstanding. He reached toward our table. Thought he was trying to grab something? No, Jake said. One word. Final. You hit him because you could. Because he looked like someone who wouldn't hit back. That's who you are. Kyle gestured toward the empty bottle beside him. I'd been drinking, maybe too much. People misread things when they're buzzed. Jake gave the faintest shake of his head. Alcohol doesn't manufacture intent, it reveals it. The bartender stepped back again, sensing something in the air that felt too heavy to stand near. A few of the bikers had quietly slipped away from the table, leaving Kyle increasingly isolated. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled a folder thinner than a book, older than most hands in the room. He opened it with care, removed a page, and placed it on the table in front of Kyle. A faded photograph stared back, black and white, time-stained. A young Frank Jennings dragging a wounded soldier across a field, his uniform soaked in blood and ash. That's Hugh City, 1968, Jake said. He carried 9 men out of a kill zone, took shrapnel to the hip, refused evac, held a position for 6 more hours so the last of his unit could escape. He was 28. He laid another paper beside it, a citation, neatly typed edges curled from decades of storage. That's the citation for his Bronze Star with V device. You don't get one of those for being lucky. Kyle didn't reach for the papers. His hands stayed locked together on his lap. Jake straightened up. You didn't hit some random old man. You struck history, a man who did more in one day of war than you've done in a lifetime of noise. The patrons in the bar had begun to shift. Quietly, without prompt, several stood not toward Jake, but away from Kyle. Chairs scraped slowly. Some gathered their things. Some just stood in place. But their posture changed. Their eyes changed, not to defend, but to distance. Jake watched it happen. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He let the moment hang, and then he turned to Leo. Get the security footage, Jake said. Everything from this morning. Leo nodded and moved toward the bar's back hallway. Jake looked to Sam, who was already pulling up his phone. Contact Crow Ridge PD. Give them the timestamps. Make sure they get it directly. Sam gave a quick nod. On it. Kyle finally spoke again, but his voice had lost any edge. What are you doing? Jake turned back toward him. Ensuring accountability. This isn't revenge. This is clarity. What you did won't disappear just because the room quiets down. Kyle looked around, hoping for someone to speak on his behalf. No one did. Jake gestured to the screen behind him. We brought evidence. You brought excuses. There was a shift near the entrance. One of the older veterans, same man who had stood moments earlier, stepped outside, muttering something to the crowd gathered beyond. Soon, more people began pressing close to the windows. Cameras lifted, phones aimed. The truth was no longer confined to this room. Jake picked up the citation page, slid it back into the folder, and tucked it under his arm. You ever want to fix what you've done, start by knowing who you struck. Because he never needed a crowd to stand. He stood long before anyone cared to look. As he turned away, the room didn't cheer. No one clapped. But they shifted toward the door, toward the windows, toward the quiet outside, where the man in question still waited. Kyle didn't follow. He remained seated, smaller than when the conversation began. Jake moved with purpose, not to punish, not to prove, but to make sure this time justice didn't get lost behind closed doors. The air inside the bar was beginning to move again, but no one dared call it normal. As Jake walked toward the exit, people parted without a word. Chairs, scraped gently, glasses were left half full, and conversation stayed buried behind tight lips. He didn't look back at Kyle. There was nothing more to say. Justice, when done right, didn't need an encore. The door opened to a different kind of tension. Outside, the crowd had nearly doubled. Locals, reporters, passers-by who'd seen the stream or heard the whispers, now all watching with the same quiet hunger. Phones were aimed, but no one shouted. No one dared. They weren't filming for spectacle. They were recording proof. Jake stepped aside, just as two black and white cruisers rolled up from the south end of Main Street. The vehicles moved slow, uncertain, unsure whether they were responding to a public disturbance or something bigger. When they stopped, the first officer out was Captain Denise Holloway, Crow Ridge PD's most senior on-site supervisor. She looked at Jake with a mixture of recognition and hesitation. "Colonel," she said, a breath catching on the word. "Ma'am," Jake replied, voice flat but respectful. "We were told there's video," she said. Jake nodded once, then gestured to Sam, who stepped forward with a tablet in hand and handed it off. "You'll want to check the timestamp against bar security footage, too. It's already been pulled." Holloway looked down at the screen, her face hardening. She turned to the second cruiser and gave a short, sharp nod. Two officers entered the bar. Less than a minute later, they returned with Kyle Mason between them, head down, arms restrained. No cuffs yet, just firm direction. Kyle didn't fight it. He didn't even speak. The crowd didn't cheer. But they did react. Shoulders eased, spines straightened. Some of the veterans watching crossed their arms with the quiet satisfaction of men who'd seen far worse and understood the value of restraint. Jake didn't step forward. He simply stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching, jaw set. When Holloway glanced at him again, he gave her a single, slow nod. It wasn't permission. It was acknowledgement. A shared understanding that sometimes order had to come from those who remembered why it existed in the first place. Frank still sat on the bench near the entrance legs, steady back upright. A paramedic approached him cautiously, holding out a hand toward the bruising on his face. "Sir, we've got an ambulance on standby. Just let us check you out." Frank looked up, eyes sharp. "I'll pass." Sir, it's standard." I said, "I'm not done here." The paramedic hesitated, then looked at Jake, who met his gaze briefly and gave the faintest shake of his head. The medic stepped back without protest. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't pride. It was something older, deeper. Frank Jennings didn't want to be ushered away like a victim. He wanted to be seen as a man who had stood, bled, and stayed. Jake walked over and stood beside him. The old wood beneath Frank's seat creaked faintly as he shifted. Neither of them spoke right away. "You handled it," Frank said after a pause, eyes forward, not looking at his son. "I didn't come to handle it," Jake replied. "I came because you shouldn't have had to sit here alone." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line somewhere between a grimace and a smile. Sometimes being seen is the only way to be heard. People continued to watch, but not in spectacle. There was reverence in the way the town stood now, quieter than before, changed somehow. They weren't witnessing a takedown. They were witnessing a reminder. Jake didn't reply. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle into the ground like an anchor. Shadow Viper remained nearby, Leo flanking the edge of the lot. Cruz pacing a slow perimeter, Sam still coordinating with Holloway. But they didn't need direction. They had been here before in different countries under different flags, but the posture was the same. Discipline, protection, resolve. The ambulance pulled away without ever being used. Jake looked down at his father. Frank looked up for the first time since the arrest. The lines on his face told more stories than any citation ever could. For 1 second, Jake saw him not just as the man who raised him, but as the soldier who never really came home from the places he'd been asked to survive. Frank didn't need medals. He didn't need a crowd. He just needed to be seen standing. Jake turned to rejoin his team. But before he moved, he paused, eyes drawn back to his father with the same expression he'd worn once as a young soldier boarding his first transport, unsure if the man on the dock would be there when he returned. And now, decades later, it was Jake who stood at the edge of the road, looking at a man who'd waited all this time for someone to finally stand beside him. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the center of gravity remained fixed. Jake stood beside his father on the wooden bench outside the iron barrel, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun. The air had shifted not in temperature, but in tone. What once felt like spectacle now settled into something closer to reverence. The buzz of camera phones and whispered updates faded into silence again, but this time it wasn't fear or tension holding people still. It was respect. Jake faced his father fully now. No words, no gestures, just a long, deliberate look between two men who had both earned silence in different ways. Jake took a single step back. His boots clicked against the concrete. Then he came to attention. Back straight, eyes steady, right hand rising in a precise arc to the brim of his brow. A military salute, clean and absolute. The kind that wasn't about protocol anymore, but about gratitude, recognition, debt. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact. He gave a simple, slow nod. No flourish, no dramatics, just a gesture of quiet acceptance that carried more weight than any verbal response could. That nod didn't signal authority. It signaled acknowledgement, from one soldier to another, from father to son, from man to man. Behind Jake, the rest of the team moved in formation, not because they were ordered, but because instinct pulled them there. Leo stood first, then Cruz, then Sam. One by one they stepped forward and lifted their hands in salute, each with a slightly different angle, but the same iron purpose. No one asked them to. No one had to. These weren't gestures of habit. They were declarations, not of allegiance, of respect. A small voice rose behind the line of onlookers. A child no older than 6 looked up at her mother, eyes wide. Why are they all saluting that old man? The mother leaned down, voice barely above a whisper. Because he protected what they're standing under. The child looked confused, then followed her mother's eyes to the flag above the bar's entrance. Weathered sun faded, but still flying. Frank blinked hard. His breathing stayed steady, but something behind his eyes shifted. For 30 years he had sat through ceremonies for others, folded flags for those who never made it home, attended funerals in silence, stood in back rows, left quietly. Always the last to leave, always the one who never asked for acknowledgement. And now here, surrounded not by generals, but by men who knew the cost of standing, he finally received something he'd never been given. Not applause. Belonging. Jake dropped his salute slowly, hand returning to his side. He didn't smile, but his eyes for the first time that day softened. The armor he wore, the kind built from discipline and war, cracked just slightly. Frank reached up with a shaky hand, not to wipe his face, but to steady himself. One tear had formed, hanging just at the edge of his left eye. He didn't brush it away. He let it fall. Not from pain, but because after decades of silence, he no longer had to fight alone. The weight of years seemed to lift with that single drop. No one moved to break the moment. Even the reporters nearby, sensing what this was, lowered their cameras. For once the story didn't need a lens. A local pastor who had been standing at the edge of the crowd whispered, "You can feel it, can't you? Like something holy just walked through." Jake turned to face the gathering again. He didn't say a word, but he gave a nod, not as a commander, not as a speaker, but as a son. One final gesture to close the moment. Then he extended a hand to his father. Frank looked at it, took it, and stood. Slow. Straight. The kind of posture that doesn't come from pride, but from knowing your knees still work when your spirit is ready to stand. The two men turned together. No announcement, no order. But the way they moved, shoulder to shoulder, left no room for misunderstanding. The town had watched a reckoning. Now it witnessed something rarer, reconciliation. The crowd parted to let them through. As they walked, a young man from the local fire department stepped forward. "Mr. Jennings," he said quietly, "you ever need anything, you just say the word." Frank didn't answer, but he paused, gave him a look of such gravity that the man simply nodded and stepped back. By the time they reached the corner of the block, the last of the afternoon light was dipping behind the hills. The crowd behind them began to scatter, but the tone had changed. Conversations were softer. Steps slower. Like the town itself had remembered something it had almost let slip. And as night settled over Crow Ridge, a single porch light blinked on at the edge of town. At the Jennings home, the lights were already glowing, steady, warm, alive. It didn't look like a house anymore. It looked like a base, quiet, solid, and finally, after too long, whole. By the time they reached the corner of the block, the last of the afternoon light was dipping behind the hills. The crowd behind them began to scatter, but the tone had changed. Conversations were softer, steps slower. Like the town itself had remembered something it had almost let slip. And as night settled over Crow Ridge, a single porch light blinked on at the edge of town. At the Jennings home, the lights were already glowing, steady, warm, alive. It didn't look like a house anymore. It looked like a base, quiet, solid, and finally, after too long, whole. The sign wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. A piece of weathered wood, sanded just enough to catch sunlight, hung beneath the old the iron barrel marquee. The letters were carved by hand dark paint, pressed into the grain with care, not precision. It read, "Built by a warrior, protected by legacy." No one held a ceremony when it went up. No speech, no music. It appeared quietly like a flag raised at dawn, subtle but impossible to ignore. A week had passed, and the town looked the same on the surface. Same cracked sidewalks, same chipped bricks, same faded window decals. But something underneath had shifted. Crow Ridge was no longer pretending not to see. That Saturday, Frank walked down Main Street without fanfare. His posture was still straight. His limp a little worse than usual, but steady. He carried no flag, no uniform, no medals. Just a folded cloth tucked into his back pocket and the same quiet presence he'd always had. This time, though, when he reached the bar, people didn't look away. The front door was open. Sunlight poured in, casting the interior in soft gold. Inside, the place had changed, but not its furniture. It was the way people sat, the way they spoke, the way they watched. At the far table, the owner, Jim Martin, whose hands used to shake when confronted with trouble, stood behind the bar without hiding. He caught sight of Frank, and instead of nodding politely like always, he stepped out from behind the counter. "Good morning, First Sergeant," Jim said. Frank shook his head gently. "It's just Frank today." Jim smiled, nervous but genuine. "You're always more than that in this place." In the back booth, a group of high school students sat hunched over notebooks. One of the girls had a microphone clipped to her hoodie. A boy beside her held a recorder. The local history teacher had started something new, an oral history project called Ask a Veteran. The bar had become the makeshift classroom. Frank didn't head toward them. Not yet. From the opposite side of the room, a soft voice spoke. "Mr. Jennings." Frank turned. A man stood near the wall, mid-40s, rough around the edges, but clean today. Black leather jacket zipped up. No patches. His head was slightly bowed. "I was here," that day, the man said. "Didn't do anything. I should have. I didn't, and I don't expect anything from you. But I was wondering, would you tell me what happened in Hugh? The room went still, not from fear, but from expectancy. Frank nodded once. No judgment, just a gesture that said, "Sit down." And the man did. Frank pulled a stool from the corner and sat across from him. Hugh, he said, was louder than anything I'd ever known. But what stuck with me most wasn't the gunfire. The others listened, some discreetly, some openly, but no one interrupted. He continued. It was the silence after. The way a city could go still while your heart was still screaming. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a war story told for glory. It was memory measured out slowly, as if every word was a shell he'd carried for decades, and only now had permission to set down. And as he spoke, the space around him changed. People leaned in, not for the details but for the meaning, not to be entertained but to understand. No one mentioned the punch anymore. It had become irrelevant. What mattered now was what the bar had become. Not a watering hole, not a battleground, but a place where accountability grew into action, where history wasn't hung on walls, it sat at tables and told the truth out loud. By late afternoon, someone had lit a candle in the front window. No one said why. It just made sense. One small flame to mark a space that now stood for something bigger than beer and bar stools. As the sun began to lower over Crow Ridge, a young boy wandered in, maybe 10 years old, no taller than Frank's chest. He walked straight up to the counter and waited until Frank noticed him. "Mr. Jennings," the boy asked. Frank turned with a gentle smile. "Yes, son." The boy hesitated, then asked the kind of question that only comes from a child, simple, disarming, impossible to prepare for. "Do you miss it? Being a soldier?" Frank didn't answer right away. He just looked at the boy, studied him for a moment, then smiled. Not the tight-lipped kind he gave adults, but something wider, warmer. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just said, "Ask me again in 20 years, when you know what it means to carry something that never leaves your hands." And the boy, without understanding all the words, nodded like he did anyway. The bar stayed quiet, but not empty. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't told, it's simply witnessed. The late afternoon settled gently over Crow Ridge, casting a soft amber hue across the rooftops and fences. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in wind or rain or song. It came in stillness, the kind that wraps itself around front porches and creaking wood, the kind you don't notice until you realize everything else has gone quiet. Frank Jennings sat on his porch, one boot resting on the bottom rail, one hand curled loosely around a chipped mug that had gone cold hours ago. The porch light hadn't come on yet, and he hadn't lit it. The day didn't need help fading. Some things knew how to leave without asking. The breeze that rustled the dry leaves wasn't sharp enough to be called a wind, but it carried something weightier. A hush, a question, a waiting. From down the block, small footsteps approached, not hurried, not hesitant, but sure, like someone who knew where they were going, but hadn't figured out what they were going to say. A boy appeared at the edge of the fence. No more than 10, scabbed knees, shoelaces untied, a Red Sox cap too big for his head. It was the neighbor's youngest, Frank remembered, lived 3 houses down, always nodding shyly when he passed, always watching. The boy paused by the bottom step, then slowly climbed onto the porch without invitation. Frank didn't stop him. He just raised an eyebrow the way he had in boot camp 40 years ago. The boy sat, legs dangling, fingers twitching slightly against his jeans. Then came the question. Soft, straight. "Mr. Jennings, were you really a hero?" Frank didn't answer right away. He looked out at the yard, watched a leaf spin once before landing. He'd been asked versions of that question before, by teachers, by journalists, by men in suits with shiny microphones who wanted something dramatic for their 6 o'clock headline. But this was different. This one came with dirt under the fingernails. With hope. He took a slow breath, then said, "No." The boy blinked. "But—" The sign at the bar, Frank shook his head gently. "A hero isn't someone who makes the news. It's someone who makes sure others still have the chance to grow up and ask the right questions." The boy frowned, thoughtful. "Then, who made you feel like a hero?" Frank smiled, small and almost sad. "That's a better question." The boy waited. Frank set the mug down beside him and leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. "The person who made me feel like I lived a life worth something was someone who didn't call me sir, who didn't salute, who never asked me about war." The boy tilted his head. Who Frank turned slowly met his eyes. "Your father. If one day you choose to stand up for someone who can't, if you speak when others stay quiet, if you walk toward a moment when everyone else is walking away, that's when you become the reason someone like me believes what we did mattered." The boy didn't reply. Not because he didn't understand, but because something about that answer didn't need explaining. A few feet away, near the side of the house, Jake Jennings stood leaning against the frame of the shed, half-shadowed in the fading light. He hadn't intended to listen. He'd come out for air, for space, for anything that wasn't the constant gravity of everything that had happened. But he'd heard every word, and when Frank spoke the final sentence, something in Jake's chest pulled tight. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again, glazed not with pride, but with something rawer. Older. He turned slightly, gaze aimed at nothing in particular, just enough to keep the boy from seeing his face, just enough to keep from interrupting what had already become sacred. On the porch, the boy wiped his palms on his jeans. "Do you miss it? Being the one who decides what's right?" Frank chuckled once, deep and brief. "I never got to decide what was right. I just learned to recognize it when no one else would say it out loud." The boy kicked at the railing gently. "I think I want to be that kind of grown-up." Frank turned to him again, serious now. "Then don't wait till you're grown. Start now. Start by noticing. Start by asking questions nobody else is asking. And if you see someone treated like they don't matter, make sure they know they do." Jake closed his eyes again. It wasn't sorrow he felt. Not exactly. It was something heavier than grief, lighter than joy, something close to clarity, like watching a torch pass without ever touching it. Frank leaned back in his chair. The sun had dipped low enough that the porch was now in full shadow. He reached down, picked up the mug again, sipped despite the cold. Then he looked at the boy. "You know what's funny," he said. "All these years people kept asking me what bravery looked like. And I think maybe it looks like a kid with scraped knees sitting on a porch asking questions that grown men are too scared to hear." The boy smiled proud, without understanding why. Jake stepped back into the house a moment later, eyes red but dry, face calm. He didn't say anything as he passed through the kitchen, just opened the fridge, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. Inside, he felt something shift. Not collapse, not break. Just settle. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying everything, because somewhere out there, a 10-year-old boy was learning how to carry part of it too. Out on the porch, Frank closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of cut grass, cooling wood, and approaching dusk. The boy had already run off back to wherever kids go when they don't need to stay. But the weight he left behind remained. Honor, it turns out, doesn't need a headline. It doesn't age. It doesn't retire. And it doesn't come from medals or ceremonies or parades. It lives in the quiet moments on porches, in glances, in questions with no right answers. It breathes in the space between generations past like breath from those who stood to those still learning how. And when no one's watching it, keeps standing. Because some things are built not from strength, but from the courage to show up when the world is still turning its back. That evening, as darkness wrapped itself around Crow Ridge once more, the porch light flickered on above Frank's chair, not for visibility, but for memory. And maybe in the end, that's what stories like this are meant to leave behind, not just a memory of a man like Frank Jennings, but a quiet challenge to all of us. A reminder that honor isn't about rank or medals. It isn't reserved for the battlefield. Sometimes it looks like an old man on a bench refusing to be moved. Sometimes it sounds like the voice of a child asking a question no one else thought to ask. And sometimes it's simply the choice to stand when the easy thing would be to walk away. Frank didn't ask to be seen. He didn't demand recognition. But when the world turned its back, he sat still long enough for someone to remember what mattered, and that was enough to change an entire town. Maybe the most powerful thing about this story isn't the punch that started it, but the silence that followed, and the people who finally decided that silence was no longer acceptable. So now we turn to you. Who's the person in your life that taught you what dignity really means? Was it a parent, a teacher, a neighbor, or maybe someone you've never thanked out loud? Drop their name, their story, or just a few words in the comments below, 'cause when we share stories like this, we help keep those values alive. If this story moved, made you think or reminded you of someone who stood tall when it mattered, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. There are more voices, like Frank's, quiet, steady, powerful, that deserve to be heard. And together we can make sure that what they stood for doesn't get forgotten. Because honor isn't something of the past. It's something we pass forward, one story at a time.